Good evening, everyone. My name is Siena Gurkova, and I'm a coordinator here at the Calgary Public Library. I work with the events and partnerships team. I would like to start our time together tonight by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered today. With gratitude, mutual respect, and reciprocity, we acknowledge the ancestral home culture and oral teachings of the Treaty 7 signatories, which include the Siksika Nation, Piikani Nation, Kainai Nation, the Itika Stony Nakoda, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Optay-Memsuak Métis government, Métis Nation, Battle River Territory, North Hill Matter District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. At Calgary Public Library, we celebrate stories, the stories of the community and the land that we live on. We serve the community of Winchispa, Gutsichi, and Mohinsis, which describes the gathering place where the Bow and Elbow rivers meet. We respect all people who share, celebrate, and care for the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta, and we honor the original caretakers of the land who remind us of the ongoing histories that precede us. We recognize our shared responsibilities going forward to help bring everyone together on this journey of truth and reconciliation. Thank you for taking the time out of your Friday evening to join us here today for the Chair of Christian Thought Labor Lecture in Christian Ethics, which will be presented by Dr. Harri Hudspith, Associate Lecturer in Visual Culture at the University of the West of England. In partnership with our friends at the University of Calgary's Department of Classics and Religion, we are proud to host Dr. Harri Hudspith for a talk on reimagining Christian mysticism not simply as ecstatic experience, but as creative practice. To begin our program, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Migotti, head of the Philosophy Department, who specializes in 19th century philosophy with a particular focus on Nietzsche and American pragmatism, including the work of peers. His research spans a wide range of areas, including ethics, philosophy of law, ancient philosophy, and the philosophy of history. He earned his PhD from Yale and has been at the University of Calgary since 1997, where he continues to work on projects exploring Nietzsche moral theory and early intellectual development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Migotti to the stage.
That is extremely flattering and gratifying. I'm the chair of the Department of Philosophy, and I'm going to introduce the introducer of our speaker, the current chair of Christian Thought, Dr. Caroline Mussig, because the chair itself is moving to the Department of Philosophy, and we're both very happy about that. At least I am, and Caroline has assured me that she is, so I'm going to take her word for it. The chair has a distinguished history. It goes back 40 years and more. Its holders have included a noted scholar of Reinhold Niebuhr, a very influential 20th century thinker on Christianity and its place in the modern world, a scholar who went on to become a professor at United Theological College, Aberystwyth, and then most recently a colleague that I knew well and had many very fruitful discussions with, Doug Schantz, who is a scholar of German Pietism and the Reformation. And the current holder of the chair, Caroline Mussig, is in no way behindhand in such august company. She's a noted scholar of pre-modern Christianity who explores preaching, religious life, and the intellectual and devotional worlds of pre-modern Europe. Particular attention to women's religious expression and authority. And she's also a dynamo as a promoter of the chair and developing a diverse and inclusive program of public lectures and conversations that bring scholars, students, and the wider Calgary community into dialogue around questions at the intersection of religion, ethics, urban, and intellectual life. And this evening's Lebel lecture is but one example of that work, bringing the university and diverse faith communities and the wider Calgary public, that's you all, I suppose, into conversation. So please join me in welcoming Caroline Musick.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that generous information and introduction. And I just want to say we're very happy, my religious studies colleagues and I, to be moving into the philosophy department in July. So we look forward to that. A special thank you as well to my co-host in organizing today's event, the Calgary Public Library, and its wonderful staff, especially Anita Gorkova, who has so warmly welcomed us into this beautiful space of learning and belonging. Thank you, Anita. The Chair of Christian Thought works closely with the people of our city through a range of partnerships with civic institutions, institutions of higher learning, higher education, and Christian communities. Together, these collaborations aim to enrich our shared life by encouraging thoughtful engagement with special issues and supporting the cultural and artistic vitality of Calgary. Now, I just want to say a few words about Louis Lebel before I introduce tonight's speaker. Jean-Louis Lebel, after whom this endowed lecture takes its name, was a businessman, scholar, and third chancellor of the University of Calgary from 1978 to 1982. Above all, he was a thoroughly engaged community participant, demonstrated by his remarkable leadership in many well-being services, including the Calgary United Appeal, the Vanier Institute, the Alberta Catholic Hospitals Foundation, the Canadian Institute for Child Health, the Alberta Heart Foundation, and the Boy Scouts, among many others. I had to cut the list short. In the fall of 1979, he joined with Dr. Peter Craigie, the former dean of the Faculty of Arts, in planning and fundraising initiatives that led to the establishment of the Chair of Christian Thought in 1985. It is an honor to hold an annual lecture in Louis Lebel's memory. Now, for tonight's speaker, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Harri Hudspith, Associate Lecturer in Visual Culture at the University of the West of England in the UK. Dr. Hudspith is an artist and a practice-based researcher who uses drawing, writing, installation, and performance to think about histories and questions of language, body, and knowledge. In 2024, they were Javier y Marta Villavecchia, postdoctoral fellow with the Haas Library at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Their most recent publications include 2 journal articles. The first, entitled The Most Virile of Monks, Gender and Transformation in the Mystical Writings of Teresa of Avila, which appeared in the Medieval Feminist Forum in 2025, and the other, entitled Toward the Sense of the Image, Reading Images of the Soul with Teresa of Avila in the Journal of Medieval Religious Cultures in 2026. So hot off the press, very hot off the press. Dr. Hudspith's approach to the study of mysticism brings together different fields, art, philosophy, theology, and psychology, to show that creativity is not separate from intellectual or spiritual life. Dr. Hudspith demonstrates that thinking, seeing, feeling, and making are deeply interconnected ways of understanding the world. This evening's lecture, Crafting Souls, Mysticism, and Creative Practice, will bring this insight into full view. demonstrating how creative practice and mystical traditions open ways of engaging with knowing and learning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hudspith, who will give this year's Chair of Christian Thought Leba Lecture in Christian Ethics. Harri.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that very kind introduction and for the warmest of welcomes that I've had here in Calgary. It is such an honour and such a pleasure to be here with you all today in this incredible building, in this wonderful city that I'm a bit obsessed with now. And thank you all as well for spending your Friday night here with me. It's always a delight to get to talk to people about what are two of my favourite things. And these are mysticisms and creative practices. Now, to help us dive into what are two arguably rather voluminous and slippery topics, I want to start with two equally voluminous and slippery questions, which are, how do you make a soul? And what do you make it from, or what do you make it with? Now, I know these are really big questions, and I will say now that I don't have a very good answer for either of them, and we probably won't have reached an answer by the end of this evening. But I wanted to start with these questions because they begin to get at something that I see as is at the heart of both creative practice and mysticism. And that is a desire for a sort of material, experiential, and embodied knowledge of what it means to be an embodied self in the world. In other words, what does it mean to be a seeing, feeling, living being entangled with a world of other seeing, feeling, living beings? This is a desire I know well, a desire which I credit with pulling me, as an artist, a non-believer in any religious faith or religious tradition, into the rabbit hole of studying Christian mysticisms. As an art student, I was always interested in the relationship between the mind and the body, or the soul and the body. But I have to say I found most mainstream philosophical, historical discussions really hard to grasp. And I wanted something that I could see, something to touch or feel, something I could effectively get my teeth into or get to grips with to work out what these ideas of being felt like for me or in me. And almost by chance, I slipped and fell down the mystical rabbit hole through this image of Teresa of Avila by the Baroque sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And I fell into the world of female, women's, or Christian mysticisms. And this is a world full of material, embodied, and experiential, and almost tangible images of the soul. Now, Teresa was the first mystic I fell for. If you're not familiar with her, she is a 16th century Carmelite nun, monastic reformer, and spiritual author, who speaks of the soul as a diamond castle constructed from 7 realms of infinite moradas, or dwelling places, in the centre of which dwells the divine. The body is the sort of outer perimeter or outer wall of the castle, and the embodied soul is both the castle structure, the castle architecture, and the spiritual pilgrim who has to walk through itself, through all of those 7 realms in search of knowledge of the divine. And Teresa recognises the apparent nonsense of this image. You know, how can you both be and enter yourself? She says it's like almost like asking someone who is already standing in a room to enter that same room. But what she says is that there are many ways of being within it. For a 16th century reader, the image of the castle is quite accessible. In the 1500s, Castile, which is now part of Spain, was full of castles, and they were a very common part of the mental and material cultural landscape. But for the 21st century reader, however, a castle is perhaps not the most tangible image of yourself. I come from the UK, which is a country full of castles, or ruins of castles, but I have to say I don't know that I find it the easiest thing to picture as both being and being inside my body. So what I'd like to suggest today is that perhaps a library, might be a more accessible contemporary image or equivalent. Like Teresa's soul, a library is a space for encountering knowledge of things other to the self, other people, others' writings, others' ideas, others' voices, other bodies. This incredible library in which we sit or stand, in particular, has, with its sort of spiraling and cellular design, has more than a few visual and material resonances with how Teresa speaks of her soul. So she describes the chambers or moradas of the soul as being not arranged one after the other in a linear fashion, but rather they're sort of articulated on all sides around each other, and they spiral around each other in the center like a palmito, which is a heart of palm vegetable. She also likens the soul to the silkworm, who spins a tight little cocoon within which it encircles itself, or a bee who works away at making honey in the hive, busily moving from cell to cell to cell. So just for a moment, I'd invite you to think about what it might feel like for your soul, for yourself, to take the form of this library. Feel free to close your eyes if that's helpful, if you feel comfortable doing so, and just consider how it might feel to both sit here within the structure and also house this structure within your body. So like Teresa's castle, this is not a disembodied soul. There is the feel of your own body in the seat beneath you, the bodies of those around you, and those in the outer realms who walk, talk, read, laugh, and listen. Then there are the remains of the bodies who are used to build the space, the books, the pages, the bookshelves, the steps. Nor is this really a static image of the soul or the self. Bodies move, they shift, they listen, they breathe. Books are brought in or borrowed and taken out. Words are drawn out and exchanged or written. So there's always this sense of movement, of interaction and exchange. There's also always a presence of the other. Now, maybe in this case, not the divine other, but maybe. But beings and elements around and within you and us with whom we are all entangled. Now, I can't take credit for this image of the soul as a library or as something connected to text or books or language. It's quite a common medieval Christian trope that I first remember encountering most clearly through another mystic, the 15th century Italian author Catherine of Bologna, who's also known in English as Catherine of Bologna. And Caterina writes of the soul being like a blank page upon which everything you read, see, or hear becomes inscribed. So you have to be careful what you listen to or what you read. Importantly, for me at least, Caterina is also an artist. She's a painter, as you can see on the screen, and she illustrates her own breviary, her own prayer book. And importantly, she is a clear example of the long-standing connection between Christian mysticisms and creative arts practices. Now, this is a connection that's often couched in modern or 20th century art terms or art history. But as Caterina evidences, this is something that goes back far deeper. And mysticism and art are rather slippery terms. Mysticism, as a word, has long been associated with religious or mystical experience, with altered states of consciousness and experiences that go beyond or sit outside of rational cognition. In a Western post-Christian context, the term conjures images of visions and ecstasies, of nuns writhing around on the floor in pain and pleasure as they receive knowledge of God and images of God. Many of the foundational discussions of mysticism define the concept by mystical experience and draw comparison with arts practices. The Victorian philosopher William James is often credited with the origins of these definitions of mysticism that define it by mystical experience. And James defines mystical experience as necessarily ineffable, passive, momentary, and noetic encounters with the divine. In his lectures on the varieties of religious experience, James suggests that the writing practices of these mystics are more akin to musical composition than to any form of rational or conceptual thought. Similarly, Evelyn Underhill, who's a contemporary of James and a mystic herself, compares the plight of the mystical author both to the musician and to the artist who, to quote her directly, tries to give us in colour, sound, or words a hint of his ecstasy, his glimpse of truth. Now, I think that both Underhill and James draw comparison to arts practices as other forms of knowing and experience that don't necessarily fit within the sort of post-Enlightenment emphasis on rationality and reason. Discussions of modern or contemporary art also often refer to the mystical or the mystic intuition of the artist, and I use heavy, what are they called? Air quotes there. And they refer to these sort of topics for the same reason. And the main thrust of what I want to say today is that I think there is some real potential, some real promise in this comparison. As an artist who's interested in ideas of knowing and learning, there is, I believe, a lot of potential in reframing mysticism as a possible alternative canon of thought on knowledge that emphasises the experiential and the embodied, and that has similar tensions with reason or rationality and logic as many arts practices do. So what I'm going to do today is suggest that one way of exploring this relationship between mysticism and creative practice is through the vessel of craft as a particular creative practice. And I think this perhaps solves some of the risks or problems that can arise from the current state of the mystic-artistic comparison as it stands with Underhill and James. So first of all, I will briefly run through a couple of these risks. First, the breadth of this comparison between mysticism and art as two huge topics can tend towards an essentialized or generalized view of what it means to be a mystic and what it means to be an artist. As the feminist scholar Grace Janssen has shown, there is no one singular stable class of who or what counts as a mystic or what counts as mystical experience throughout Christian history, let alone across religious traditions. And who or what counts as a mystic or as mysticism is always defined by dynamics of power, authority, and gender. Even in the 100 years between Caterina de Vigeri's birth in 1413 and Teresa of Avila's birth in 1515, what makes a woman a mystic, rather than someone influenced or possessed by the devil, is not a stable category within the European Catholic Church, although it is almost always defined by the male epistemological and ecclesial elite. That is why, to borrow from Janssen, we cannot legitimately assume that there is one thing that is mystical experience or mysticism. And that's why quite often I borrow from her suggestion that we talk about mysticisms in the plural rather than in the singular. I would also suggest that we cannot make the same assumption regarding a universal definition of the artist for those same reasons. My practice, for example, to be selfish for a minute, would not fit within Underhill's vision of the artist trying to give a glimpse of his ecstasy or a glimpse of his truth. Because to make, for me, is not to strive for ecstasy. It's not to try to give you guys a glimpse of some ecstatic truth that only I have access to, but rather it's a way of working something out. It's a way of grappling with the contours of a question that I don't quite yet know for myself. Now, more contemporary scholarship on mysticism than James and Underhill has rightly shifted to recognise that narrow definitions like James's tend to exclude a whole wealth of related experiences and writings. For example, many of Teresa's visions would be too embodied, too visual, too graphic, perhaps, to fit within James's classification of mystical experience as an unsayable, passive experience of God that is beyond any sense of the body or any sense of words, any sense of language. In particular, the sculpture or the vision that inspired this sculpture does not meet James's mystical criteria, unfortunately. That's why I think it's much better, if I'm going to borrow from the wonderful scholar Bernard McGinn here, that we think about mysticisms as a process or a way of life, not as a single moment of experience. Now, mysticism as a term does not actually emerge until the 1700s, centuries after the phenomena's medieval heyday. The notion of the mystical, however, is a lot older and emerges in the mystery religions of ancient Greece, and through early Christianity, it becomes associated with a search for the mystical meaning of Scripture. Scripture, as the Word of God, was considered to conceal the hidden truth of Christ, who is the Word incarnate, and who could be revealed through practices of reading and interpretation. These practices don't reveal him through discursive argumentation or rational thought, but by moving the soul towards God. So they move the soul towards knowledge of God by experience. Throughout the centuries which precede Katharina and Teresa's births, this sense of the mystical pursuit of meaning from God becomes increasingly entangled with monastic practices of reading, writing, and praying the Bible, and consequently with the sort of ways of life of many monks and nuns in medieval Europe. As such, we can think about Christian mysticisms as encompassing both extraordinary experiences of the divine and, to quote Bernard McGinn again, all that leads up to and prepares for the divine encounter. Or, as the theologian Peter Tyler has suggested, we can think about mysticism as being as much a verb as it is a noun. It's a way of coming to or making knowledge of God. And in my mind, this allows us to think of mysticism as a practice of moving the soul towards God through devotional or mystical practices of reading, prayer, writing, and meditation. Now, the second risk of this mystic-artistic comparison is a bit more of a risk to understandings of creative practice. Comparison between arts practices and mysticism as a moment of passive revelation of unsayable divine knowledge risks reviving the romanticized notion of the artist as a divinely inspired genius. This is a rather outdated vision, which sort of harkens back to the Romantic period. But as the artist Bill Prosser has highlighted, it is a myth that is still alive and well and lives on in society's heroic romanticizing of celebrity-mad artists like Vincent van Gogh, for example. Similarly, the sense of passivity in this mystical comparison risks fueling the very much alive and kicking myth that real creativity should be effortless, that true art is made in a flurry or a frenzied channeling of something ecstatically beyond the self. And this emphasis on passivity is not necessarily even true for mystics, I think. Catherine of Siena, for example, the 14th century Dominican mantellate or laywoman, and mystical author, and another one of my favourite mystics, is a prime example of the active nature of mysticism. Like Teresa, Catherine walks hundreds and hundreds of miles across her homeland, and she's famed for her radical asceticism, for pushing herself to the limits of her soul and her body to care for those around her. The labour and love of this work is most evident when she dies from exhaustion and starvation at only 33 years old. So as the scholar Kim Wilkins has argued, the myth of passivity underpins many of our cultural conceptions of creativity. Within this particular context for today, it risks erasing the creative labour and practices of mystics and artists alike. Now, the final and perhaps most tricky problem of this mystic-artistic comparison is a question of language. So it's nothing new or radical to recognise that many mystics, Teresa, Catherine, Katharina included, were or are literary artists engaged in highly creative writing, teaching and preaching practices. Both mystics and artists speak of the challenges of writing or talking about their practices, about the knowledge that comes through their experiences. Bill Prosser, for example, aligns himself with Pride and Prejudice's Mrs. Bennet when she says that she feels as though English is not her native tongue. And for Prosser, drawing feels perhaps more like his mother tongue than speaking English words. And Teresa alludes to a similar feeling when she speaks of how the interior things that she learns from the divine in the soul are so dark, they're so obscured, that she must say many superfluous and even nonsensical things in order to say one thing that finds its mark. Similarly, Catherine of Siena cries, what shall I say? I will stutter, because there is nothing else I know how to say. Before encountering these women, I would have echoed Prosser's struggle to find the right words that don't let experience slip through their gaps. But having sat with their works for some time now, my feelings towards language have shifted. As Grace Janssen has argued, these mystical articulations at the limits of language are not signs of frustrated attempts to translate unsayable experience into words, but rather highlight that language is a key site of mystical creativity. These comments are an invitation to experiment with language, to stretch it to its limits, so that its very articulacy might lead beyond itself to the silence of God. For Teresa and for Catherine, as for myself, the tension with language is not a sort of question of ineffability or unsayability, but it marks language out as the site of making, of knowing and meaning. Now, at the core of these three risks or problems sits a parallel in the way we talk about art and the way we talk about mysticisms. As the philosopher Kate Kirkpatrick has pointed out, most philosophical and theological accounts of visual arts focus exclusively on consuming or viewing art made by other people. And yet, if you speak to most artists or makers, we're far more interested in what happens in the processes of making than any sort of knowledge that is embodied in the final thing itself. I would argue that discussions of mysticism have historically had a parallel focus on the sort of momentary experience of God rather than the practices and teachings that mystics were engaged in and which underpinned those experiences, and which were for many, Teresa, Catherine and Caterina included, just as important, if not more important, than those instances of divine encounter. So with these risks in mind, over the past few years, I've come to think that rather than drawing a mystic-artistic comparison, we really ought to be thinking of mysticisms as a creative practice in and of itself, or themselves. And I use the term creative practice here, rather than art or arts practice, to give space for alternative forms of practices of making that are not normally encompassed within the sort of wider cultural focus of discussions around art, which tend to be very much directed towards visual arts. So here I'm thinking about music and performance, dance and writing, but in particular for today, we're thinking about craft. And this is where we get to the nitty-gritty of what I'm going to suggest, which is that thinking about mysticism as a craft practice might allow us to think more about the creative power of mysticism without falling into the traps of these old arty stereotypes. Now, unfortunately, craft is another very slippery term. And for centuries, it's been associated with the crafts, with particular materialities and modalities of making that have been deemed other to art. So things like weaving, embroidery, metalwork, basketry, jewellery making, the list goes on and on and on. These crafts have long been denigrated as lesser creative practices, deemed to involve a lesser degree of intellectual effort or appeal than art, which is dedicated to purely visual contemplation. Craft instead has been considered a question of manual skill and functionality, and it's been associated with the feminine, the working classes, the amateur and the indigenous. Basically, craft has been considered not as clever, not as sophisticated, not as intellectual, and not as tied to the pursuit of truth or true meaning as visual art. And yet, as the curator and author Glenn Adamson has pointed out, just what makes these particular creative practices craft rather than art is really hard to put your finger on. And instead, he argues that it's perhaps more helpful to think about craft as a constellation of concerns that relate to the material experiences that run through all forms of making of creative practice. This constellation of concerns is made up of things like process, materiality, embodied and tacit knowledge, temporalities, skill, and functionality. To put it another way, craft effectively allows for an attention to the behind-the-scenes processes of making, rather than a focus on the final object. And so for this behind-the-scenes focus, I want to suggest that craft might be a more helpful way of thinking about mysticism and the dynamics of creativity, labour, and knowledge. Now, there's one caveat before we do a bit of a deep dive into a particular example of mysticism as craft, and that is that here I'm not referring to the crafts performed by pre-modern mystics, such as gardening, cooking, sewing, weaving, illuminating and copying manuscripts. These are really, really important and form part of devotional practices, but they just sadly fall beyond the scope of what we have time for today. Instead, what I want us to think about is mysticism as this sort of practice of moving the soul towards God, as a form of interior craft or soul making. And in the interests of specificity, and to avoid that sort of trap of essentialization and generalization, I'm going to talk about one particular form of Christian mysticism, and that is that of Teresa of Avila. And we're going to use some of Glenn Adamson's constellation of concerns to think about how she crafts her soul. So the first star in Adamson's constellation that we're going to use is process. And in his 2018 book, Thinking Through Craft, Adamson highlights that craft is fundamentally a question of process. To quote him, he says, "It is an approach, an attitude, or a habit of action. Craft only exists in motion. It's a way of doing things." And at the heart of Teresa's imagery of the soul, I think there is a very similar sense of motion, of doingness, of this sort of habit of action. For example, we might think back to that image of the soul as a silkworm spinning its own little cocoon, or of the bee busily working away in the hive. But this emphasis on mystical practice or mystical process, rather than divine experience, is most evident, I think, in her image of the soul castle. This is not just a sort of literary image for the soul, but it's the structuring concept for her final book, Las Moradas del Castillo Interior, which was written in 6 months in 1577. And the text is structured in 7 groups of chapters that reflect the 7 realms of the soul. And these chapters detail how the soul walks through the castle towards the divine. So she sort of takes you on the journey through the castle, through the structure of the book. 85% of this book talks about the practice of walking through the castle. It talks about the journey. Only the final 4 chapters talk about the destination or begin to address what happens in union with the divine. And even in those final chapters, Teresa never really tells us what happens or what she sees, what she comes to know of the divine. Instead, she's far more focused on guiding her reader along the path to this innermost chamber of themselves. Because although she speaks of her own mystical experiences in the inner realms of the soul, she doesn't include them as sort of illustrations of experience, but they are included as demonstrations of the nature of this journey. And this journey is walked through a process called recogimiento, which is a kind of devotional practice that was very popular in Renaissance Castile, and that was sort of conceptualized as a meditative withdrawal into the soul in search of God who dwells within. Now, Teresa's version of recogimiento is a combination of reading, prayer, writing, and meditation, which she describes at times as being like a conversation between friends, to quote Bernard McGinn's translation of her phrase, and a process of walking with the best company of Christ. Now, this is not necessarily the easiest thing to get your head around from those 2 quotes, but I think perhaps the most approachable way to understand what she's really doing, or what she's trying to teach us, is through this instruction, which is to take a scene from the Passion, let us say the arrest, and wander within its mysteries, considering all there is in it to think and to feel. So she reads, a scene of the Passion from a prayer guide like Ludolf of Saxony's Vita Christi, and she imaginatively envisions the narrative of Christ's suffering and death, and she sort of steps into it as a seeing and feeling participant. She imagines herself wiping the sweat and blood from his brow. So this is a kind of mental image making. It's almost like a kind of really intense form of fan fiction where she reimagines or redevelops the Passion narrative by inserting herself into the story. And this is the process of walking with Christ through the Passion, which is also the process of walking through the castle of the soul. And Teresa repeatedly evokes John 14:6, saying that no one will come to the Father except by me. And she uses this to emphasize that Christ is the guide who leads you through the soul to God at the end. So Christ is kind of this material marker, sort of a tangible, embodied image that will lead the soul through the processes of this journey. Now, this journey is not just a change in position or the overcoming of a distance, getting deeper into yourself, but it's also a transformation of the soul's very nature. Because as Teresa walks the path of the soul, she follows in Christ's footsteps, both sort of literally and more metaphorically. Because this meditative reading is a form of imitatio Christi, which is a sort of intense and embodied engagement with Christ's suffering that serves as a form of empathetic identification. Literally a kind of seeing and feeling with Christ to become like him, to feel as he felt. For many Christian mystics, Teresa included, the path towards God is the path to spiritual perfection. And it's trodden in the likeness of Christ, who is effectively the original embodied image of such perfectness. And in the tradition of recogimiento, this perfecting is often framed as a kind of remaking of the soul that has, I think, some very crafty undertones. For example, Francisco de Osuna, who's a 15th century Spanish author from whose text Teresa learns about the practice of recogimiento, talks about this practice as a process of repairing the soul, which is broken and cracked like a clay vessel that's beyond any usable function anymore. And Teresa repeatedly echoes this sense of material perfecting. For example, she talks about the soul as being like gold in the crucible, which emerges refined and clarified. Even more crafty is the way that she talks about how her mystical interactions with God reshape the form of her soul. In the 6th realm of the castle, in the penultimate stages of the soul's journey, Teresa begins to experience different forms of ecstatic visions, in which God reveals his mysteries of himself to her. Often these are visions of Christ's humanity. And Teresa speaks of what she sees of her beloved being so deeply impressed, imprimido, and engraved, esculpida, into the material of her soul that she will never be able to forget what he has shown her or said to her. So she's sort of talking about a reforming and remaking of herself in the image of Christ. And this sense of remaking, of sculpting, carving, brings us to the next star in Adamson's constellation, which is materiality. And by this, Adamson is referring to the idea of material experience, so an attention to the embodied experience of working with a material or a medium, the tacit haptic and embodied knowledge that emerges in weaving willow into a basket or from the weight of the chisel in your hand against the stone. And there's a similar material attention to many of Teresa's images of remaking the soul. For example, when she talks about the soul as the silkworm, it's not quite a silkworm, it's a caterpillar and a butterfly, but you get the right idea. When she talks about the soul as the silkworm, she constructs the image of this process step by step by step, alluding to how they are first placed on mulberry leaves when they're really tiny, and then as they grow larger, they're placed into the branches, and there they go about themselves with their little mouthpieces, spinning silk and making tight little cocoons within which to enclose themselves. And then here the worm may die, and be reborn as a delicate white butterfly. This process of spinning is the same process of walking the castle. It's the devotional practice of recogimiento. And its meditative actions not only allow the soul to wander through itself, but to re-spin or reweave the very fabric of itself and turn itself into something new. There's something really appealing to me about these sort of more than human crafts that Teresa is alluding to the spinning of the silkworm and the recurrent image of the bee in the hive that she uses quite often. The bee in particular was a common medieval icon for humility, and Teresa draws on these more than human crafts to emphasize the diligence and creative labor involved in her mystical practice. So she says, "But if you had not seen it, except for what they had told you, who could believe it? Nor what reasoning could we gather from the fact that a thing so without reason as a worm or a bee could be so diligent in its work for our benefit, and with such industry, and that poor little worm loses its life to the task." So we get the sense here, in this image of the silkworm and the bee and the castle as well, that for Teresa, mysticism is actually really hard work. Her writings are not sort of glorious tales of wondrous visions and extraordinary experiences. They are there, of course, but instead we get the sense that what she's trying to tell us is that this is a labour of love that remakes herself, and it's really difficult. Now, on to the third star in the constellation, and this is one that Adam suggests is the handiest marker of crafts, and that is skill. Because crafts have long been associated with fine working, with manual dexterity and detail. And for all its supposedly intellectual prowess, modern visual art is often subjected to the claim that my toddler could have made that painting. And this is not a critique that is often thrown at professional crafts, at, leather workers and welders. And in a Christian mystical context, the question of skill can be a little bit tricky, because the traditional view of this movement of the soul towards God envisions this journey as a transition from active practice to passive experience. And this is a fundamentally relational process. It's not a path that can be walked alone, and Teresa is very, very clear about this. The soul can actually only walk through the first 3 realms of itself before it needs God to begin to pull it into the deeper realms of the castle. And also, this divine reciprocation is not guaranteed. She's very lucky. But she's clear that for any hope of reciprocation, you have to do your part skillfully. You have to do the practice well in hopes of a return. And she warns the reader that you cannot build towers without strong foundations. In other words, the founding stones of the castle have to be placed really firmly in practice so that the divine can then help you build it to its glorious heights. This skilled interior craft is also not something to be given up if or when the divine does begin to reciprocate. Because although you cannot enter the inner realms of the castle if he does not begin to draw you in, Teresa warns that at no point should you lose Christ, who is your guide in meditation, or you will fall from the path. So this is not a simple transition from active practice to passive experience. Instead, there's always this sense of motion, of doing, of action. The little butterflies you can see should, hopefully, always be flapping his wings, but he doesn't want to. It's a bit sad. The final star in the crafty constellation that I want to touch on is functionality. And this is the idea that, whilst art is a form of making that is for purely visual contemplation or for beauty, craft is a form of making that has a functional purpose in mind. You're making something that's going to be used in a particular way. And with Teresa's mysticism, there is clearly a divine purpose in mind. She is driven by love to come to know God, and the remaking of herself is not simply for fun. It's probably not very fun, actually, a lot of the time. But it's a necessary part of this process of moving closer to her beloved. But there is another dimension to this functionality of her mysticism, and this is one that perhaps marks the closest point where she begins to engage in what we might think of traditionally as a craft, and this is her writing practice. Like many other mystics, Teresa is a rather prolific author, although she doesn't begin to write professionally or mystically until she's in her late 40s. Interestingly, it's actually exactly the same time she begins to receive mystical experiences. In the last 20 years of her life, she pens numerous books, letters, accounts of her foundations, exegeses, poems, reflections. There's a whole wealth of Teresa out there. And under the traditional conceptions of mysticism, like those from Underhill and James, mystical writing is viewed as a frustrated attempt to put into words the ineffable experience of God that one begins to have. However, as both McGinn and Charles Stang have shown, writing actually often forms a key action within devotional practices, alongside prayer, meditation, and reading, and this sort of more Victorian view is not really accurate. For example, Marguerite Duin, the French 14th century mystical author, speaks of how God has so deeply and fully inscribed things upon her heart that she must turn to writing herself in order to relieve some of this pain and pressure. Her heart is basically so full that she can think of nothing else but putting pen to paper, which then becomes part of her mystical devotional practice. She sort of develops this really delicious vicious circle of inscription and inscribing, of being written in or on, and then taking to writing that then becomes part of a text for her own meditation and for others' meditations. And I think the final strand of Teresa's soul craft follows a very similar pattern. Because when she takes up the pen in the 1550s, it's partly due to the orders of her confessors to prove the orthodoxy of her practice and the validity of her mystical experience, to prove that she's not possessed by the devil. But it's also something that is done by divine command, because he tells her, she should share this knowledge, this experience that she's been having. So in mystical visions, the divine carves his mysteries into her soul, and then she takes to the page to craft texts which seek to inspire the reader to embark on that same path for themselves. As Peter Tyler has shown, the poetics of Teresa's imagery are not simply attempts at crafting the most beautiful textual image, but they are a pedagogical strategy that seeks to provoke what Tyler talks about as a kind of change of aspect in her reader. They're a strategy that aims to move the reader towards embodied action, towards practice. And so through these floods of vivid images, Teresa does not tell us what she comes to know of God, but she shows us how to engage in her model of recogimiento, how to come to this knowledge for yourself, hopefully. As such, we can think of Teresa's writing process not only as a key point in her own mystical remaking of herself, but as a strand of her craft which seeks to remake the souls of her readers. And here we come nearly, hopefully, full circle back to Catherine of Bologna and her image of the soul as a blank page, in this sense of reading something being engraved and inscribed into your sense of self. So if we think of Teresa's mysticism as a crafting of souls, we can extend this beyond the remaking of her own soul to the remaking of others. So, hopefully by now I'm not alone in thinking that there are some promising resonances between the way Teresa speaks about her mysticism, both her experiences of God and her practice, and critical conceptions of craft. But what is the purpose of this crafty repositioning? For me, one of the main benefits of this perspective is that it allows an attention to Teresa's emphasis on practice, on motion, on doing, on action. Craft's more behind-the-scenes focus perhaps allows for creative practice reading that aligns more closely with Teresa's own pedagogical and practical concerns than the sort of previous artistic comparisons. The other key benefit, particularly from a sort of feminist, womanist historical perspective, is that by thinking about her mysticism as a soul craft, we're able to attend to the sense of creative labour and work that Teresa describes, and which is overlooked in that sort of common cultural conception of mysticism as being all about ecstatic experience. This allows us to recognise Teresa's active role in the remaking of her soul and the remaking of herself, and perhaps position her more as a co-collaborator in the construction of knowledge of the divine than simply a passive, empty vessel. But why is this important? Unless, like me, you're obsessed with a load of long dead and quite dusty nuns, this is not going to make a huge difference to how we think about knowing and being in the world. So I'm going to like to finish by hopefully explaining what I see as the wider possibilities or impacts of thinking about mysticism as a creative practice. Now, this mainly comes out of the fact that we are at a point, at least in the UK, which is the only context I can speak for really, where higher education is becoming ever increasingly commercialised. Knowledge and learning are commodified as something to be bought at great expense. Each year, thousands of students pay hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars to access places and spaces where we think learning and knowing happen. Knowledge is thought of as something to be possessed. At the moment, it's a sort of stepping stone on the way to somewhere else, which must be worked for in a particular form and within a particular context. Having been an art student for quite a long time, and now as a teacher of artists and humanities students, it's very evident to me that our current models of knowledge and learning make little to no space for the kinds of knowledge that are key to creative practices and to mysticisms, and arguably to the way we all live our lives day to day. By this I mean knowledge that comes from experience, from seeing, feeling, and being. The embodied or tacit knowledge that comes from having repeatedly worked with a particular medium or a particular pen, repeatedly walking a path or a route, or repeatedly feeling what happens when you combine one thing with another. As the writer and curator Martina Margetts puts it, these are the forms of hidden embodied knowledge of making that are dangerously disregarded by government policymakers. Admittedly, these are ways of knowing that can be quite hard to talk about, but they are not unsayable nuggets of knowledge beyond the self or beyond the divine. Rather, I would argue, they just don't fit within the standard models of articulation and assessment, and so they slip through the gaps and become undervalued. Now, please don't get me wrong, I don't want to harken back to some idealised vision of a medieval mystical utopia of knowing, but rather what I want to suggest is that we might reclaim or remake perhaps certain mysticisms as an alternative epistemological history. We might reframe the ideas of figures like Teresa, Catherine, and Caterina as an alternative canon of thought which prioritises the embodied, the experiential, the haptic or tacit forms of knowing that are an unavoidable part of living and being in the world. In doing so, we might borrow their examples, not literally or spiritually, unless you want to, but we might borrow them as a way of making space for these hidden and dangerously disregarded and undervalued forms of knowing that recognise knowledge not as a product or an object on the path towards somewhere else, but a process in which we are all entangled as we live with the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Amen for that. That was amazing. I enjoyed that very much. I have a lot of questions, and we have a half hour for questions, so I can open up the floor for anybody who would like to start. Yes, Ron. Yeah. Oh, we need to.
I hope this is coherent. I've been thinking about your the library analogy, and it reminded me of something I saw coming in. Right? So a lot of homeless people use the library here. Right? There's a shelter nearby. And when I was entering and using the washroom, there are some security folks who, this isn't an accusation or anything. They're getting a woman out of the bathroom. Right? Maybe she was on drugs, maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, the library metaphor really got me. So if you think of it as where the soul occupies and sort of forming the structure of the soul. What I was seeing there were like institutional, maybe necessary institutional structural constraints, sort of defining the scope and limits of compassion, right? Which the analogy is a wonderful one, and that's.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I'm really glad that it resonated for you. It was something so I'm a bit obsessed with libraries anyway, and I saw the visual resonances with Teresa and the library before I came from Google. But yesterday, Janita gave me a very wonderful tour and sort of opened the library up to me of how much wonderful work they do here and how much it's sort of, the ideal utopian form of what a library should really be. And the way it makes space for everyone, whoever, how accessible it is and how it is a structure for care, which is what I think Teresa and Catherine of Siena are basically talking about with the soul. And that sense that there is, your soul, if you retreat into your soul, that's not a retreating from the world or running away, shutting yourself off. Even if you're an anchorite and you wall yourself up in a cell like Julian of Norwich did, you're not hiding away from the world. She was still very much a key figure within Norwich's social and spiritual life. She just did it from behind a wall. And there's something, I think, very powerful to me that I find very appealing, but it's also quite difficult to live with and sit with, is the sense that these models of being or the soul are inherently sort of talking about a sense of entanglement with everyone else and everything else on the planet. That's why the library one, as you say, is a really powerful one to think about, that, with the presence of unhoused people in here, it makes them, in the best way possible, unavoidable, that you can't overlook, and you have to acknowledge that they are part of us, they are with us. We are all interconnected in a way that we have sort of lost sight of, and it's very hard to live with a lot of the time, to think about it on that level. And my favourite mystical image for that is Catherine of Siena, when she talks about the soul as a vine that's engrafted into the vines of all of its neighbours, and you're so entangled with everyone else. So actually, if you think about grafting as the cutting of an end and sticking it into another plant so it grows as one, you are so united and universally one that you can do no good and no harm without doing the same for your neighbour. And I think that's almost more of the library than Teresa is, really.
So as you were talking, thank you very much for the talk, I was thinking about Marguerite Poré. I've probably butchered that name, so I apologize. But because I have some thoughts about how she might fit into this picture, but of course her project is to annihilate the soul, not to create it. And so I was curious whether you had any thoughts about whether she does fit into this picture.
I want her to fit into this picture, and I have a lot of love for Marguerite. I think she's completely nuts in the most wonderful way. And there are some really interesting resonances with the way she talks about that annihilation of the self, that sort of apophatic polishing of the mirror until every sense of yourself disappears, which is such a great image. And there's some quite good resonances between that and the way Teresa talks about the transformation of the soul, although she's a bit more material. I don't think anyone could describe Marguerite as sort of that material, although there is an attention to materiality in that polishing, I think. But Teresa talks about, she uses these sort of mirror images as well, and that sense of carving the self away as a perfecting is effectively a sort of apophatic whittling back of the soul to what it should be in its original perfect form. So it can be a repairing, and I think that's a bit more of a wholesome way of thinking about it, but there is a similar echo of this kind of radical apophaticism. And I'm just trying to think about how to pull it back to the sort of more joyful vision of the soul that I hope everyone might leave with. And there's something, I think in Marguerite, although she's often talked about as being quite negative, both in the sort of negative theological sense, but also I think we're quite afraid of that idea of losing your completely annihilating your sense of self. But actually there's possibly space in there to think about it as, like Catherine's image of the vine, if you recognize that you're so entangled with everything else in the world, then your sense of self is completely undone from where you are now. And so there is possibly space there to think about grafting as a kind of polishing. But I haven't worked that out fully, but thank you.
Thank you so much for such a rich talk. And thank you for that last question. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between madness and mysticism. You've touched on it quite a bit, and it is, I guess, particularly from a historical perspective, there seems to be a lot of space to interpret what is demonic and what is mystic. And as well as then you made a more modern reference to Van Gogh, who did suffer from mental illness and created some amazing things. And so I'm just wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I'm always slightly wary of this topic, only not that it's not a good question, more that what I'm going to say I will couch in very tentative terms, partly because there has been at the same time as William James and Evelyn Underhill, you get the birth of psychoanalysis and Freud talking about, writing about some female mystics like Teresa as hysterics, as women who have completely lost their marbles and lost the sort of their reason and their the sort of boundaries of their self. And so he tries to sort of post-mortem psychopathologize Teresa, and in doing so kind of dismisses her, sweeps her under the carpet. And so there's a bit of a risk, I think, in this trying to retrospectively diagnose someone into contemporary terms. Because if, many of these mystics were alive and kicking today, they probably would be institutionalized, sadly, because they engage in forms of behavior and activities that are seen as harmful to themselves and harmful to others. For example, Catherine's sort of radical asceticism involved her basically starving herself to death. And I'm going to forget his name. I think it's Rudolf Bell has written a whole book about holy anorexia and the kinds of, how we might think about the relationship between anorexia nervosa and I think he might call it anorexia mystica, but I can't, holy anorexica. And thinking about, to what extent is that a practice of self-harm, self-destruction? But I think one of the important things that gets lost in that sense of madness or mental illness is that there is, I'm going to be very careful here, not get it wrong, I'm not an expert in psychology or mental illness at all, but what I see for these mystics is there's a very distinct sense of purpose to their actions that pulls it slightly apart from how we would think about mental illness today. The reference to Van Gogh, particularly from a sort of artistic perspective, is more thinking about, I think it comes from Plato, that idea of the artist being engaged in some kind of divine frenzy, that's where the flood of work comes out from, and that is actually, compared to mystics, that's actually a sort of acceptable, culturally valued form of madness, whereas, or at least, looking back, retrospectively, that's a sort of slightly more acceptable form. Marjorie Kemp wailing in the street and upsetting everybody, and, would be probably arrested for disturbing the peace or something like that now. Yeah. Sorry, that was a bit rambling. I hope that sort of answered.
Where does the soul exist in the body? Like, assuming that the soul is something that can occupy space, and also how's the soul tied to like a specific body so that the soul isn't floating away to someone else's?
It's a very, very good question. I can only speak, so my vision of the soul is very tied to Teresa and how I understand her idea of the soul. And I think she's sort of, carved herself into me a bit too far, which makes it hard to talk about much else. And so the way I see the soul, particularly the castle structure, as being sort of, it extends throughout the entire interiority of her body, or of the body. And it's almost, when she's talking about, I'll just go back to this image for a second, because she talks about the moradas, the dwelling places, as like being a bit like the beehive, or this sort of, they're sort of articulated all around each other. And in my mind, they become almost like little hexagonal cells that's got this kind of cellular structure that echoes how we understand the structure of the body now, or the structure of the sort of materiality of the body on a cellular level. The other thing that really tickles me is the fact that she talks about it as a diamond castle, and we now know that the atomic structure or molecular structure, finally, of diamond is this kind of almost cellular hexagonal pattern. I've got some drawings of this that I wish I'd included now. So I sort of see the soul as encoded and encrypted throughout the very depths of the body. And by that I mean not quite on like a microscopic level, but in that level of intensity of deepness, in that it's not in one particular place. It might have particular intensities in particular places. So Teresa talks about a particular intensity being in the top of your head. That's where she thinks your spirit is, as like the innermost part of your soul. But it also has intensities in your guts, basically, in your stomach. And yeah, it is the body, and the body is the soul. And those two things, it can't float off and become someone else's, because it is you. You'd have to go with it, unless your body becomes the body of someone else. And then we're heading back towards the vine image, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But this sort of sense of it is so much yourself, but that sense of self is not necessarily isolated to the sort of hard limit of the body that we might think about now as like I end at my fingertips or my skin. The sort of medieval and pre-modern vision of the body is much more porous. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your soul seeps out, hopefully.
I really have to thank the Lord for these lectures. I mean, that was such a great lecture, very stimulating. My question is, I found myself during the lecture, I was like nodding along. I was like, yes, this is what I've been, yes. So my question is you, the whole lecture was about working on yourself and crafting yourself. But I'm wondering how we are also a craft worked on by God, because in the Orthodox tradition, there are holy icons, and in those icons you see the holiness of the saints, the holiness of Lord Jesus Christ, and that ordering, that beauty that comes from the ordering, kind of mirrors the Greek word logos. I mean, you know the word, though if anybody doesn't know, which I'm pretty sure everybody probably does in this room, it's a word for order, reason, and word. And in moving towards God, we're not only working on ourselves, but also our logos is being tilled and worked on by the Lord to be ordered. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how, if you were asked a question, that's a more reverse to your lecture. How much are we worked on in a craft by God?
Yeah, brilliant. I can speak to this from a probably more medievalist perspective and from a personal perspective, because I'll start with my nuns, because for Teresa and for Catherine, it's very much what I've tried to suggest today is that they are at least as much involved in the process of remaking, of recrafting, as God is, hopefully. I don't know that they would agree with me on that, because for them, he is very much the original artist, the original creator. And so he is the one who does that very, the ultimate sort of carving and sculpting and engraving for Teresa. He's the one for Catherine who sort of waters the garden with his blood after you've pruned the thorns of the vineyard. And Teresa talks about him, has another image where she talks about watering, prayer as watering the garden, this sort of mystical process as the process of weeding and tilling the soil and bringing water to the garden in different ways. And the most efficient and effective way of watering the garden is to hope that God rains on it. And so it's very much rooted in you've got to do all the work so that God will hopefully do the work too. So it's a co-collaboration of remaking that is very much found in in these kind of crafty images. The other one I found the other day is about Catherine of Siena and Catherine of Bologna, both using this idea of the soul, or Christ as the anvil, where the soul is worked, is sort of beaten into shape, either by the devil, I think for Caterina, or by God. And it's this sort of material reworking of the soul as an anvil. From my perspective, I don't believe in a God in the sort of traditional Christian sense. I don't quite know what I believe in currently. The main thing I believe in is Catherine and Teresa and Caterina. I've gotten to the point now where I've gone so far down this rabbit hole where they are my gods, my sort of mystical ancestors. And I do think that they have reshaped my sense of self, my understanding of myself and the world. They have sort of, I'm not going to say literally, but materially inscribed themselves into my brain in that I have memorized chunks of their text that pop up at weird and wonderful times. And that sort of sense that there is this presence, there is this sense that in the same way that family members or beloved animals or, favorite landscapes, objects are part of your sense of self. These long dead women are part of my sense of self. And they have done, there is a bit of a mystical thing there where they have done some of the inscribing themselves. Yeah.
In relation to the working on the soul and the crafting, there seems, the way the soul is presented by Teresa is that there's a plasticity to it, that it can be imprinted, the way Caterina speaks about this, and the impressionability and the possibility for improvement. And just tying that to your question and observation about, the world today and education, I wonder what that tells us really. Is there a relation between the attitude towards the purpose of education and how it can shape the human? Is it just that has been jettisoned, do you think, in your experience in the British education that you were alluding to? Is there, because there seems to be this optimism in the mystics that you're presenting of this improvement of the soul, hence self.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to be in a slightly biased position here, because I would say that I don't know if you asked most of my students whether they go to university to make themselves better is really not the right word, but to improve themselves in the sort of almost bit woo-woo spiritual self-help kind of way, I don't think any of them would say that. But if you asked a group of art students if they went to art school to improve themselves, I would hope some of them might say they do, because at least in my experience, there's a bit more of a close proximity between art practice as something you go to study or you go to develop. It's your own thing. You most of the time already have it when you go to art school. It's something that's already part of you. And that you develop and work on, and it's sort of aimed at improving that practice. And I know that in at least a few places in the UK, that's still alive and kicking, that sense of, this is part of you. I had a tutor called Colin, who I talked about in the workshop earlier, who I always feel gets a bad deal when I talk about him. But he used to repeatedly say, you are an artist with a practice. You are an artist with a practice. And it was really infuriating at the time. But what that sort of translates to now, and the way I understand it and use it for my students, is that your practice is a way of seeing and being in the world. And that is wholly part of yourself. That is really tied to who you are. And I think we should be thinking the same, and I'm sure, please tell me if I'm wrong, probably people in the room who are thinking the same for non-arts practices, for other disciplines, for want of a better word. But I do think we've lost a sense of that plasticity, or that almost that porosity in terms of the medieval mystical way of thinking about the self and knowledge, is that the boundaries between the sort of subject and object are softer, they're more porous. So knowledge is inscribed into yourself, it's part of who you are. Whereas now I think we are far more distanced between what your selfhood is and the knowledge that you're going to obtain as a thing, rather than a process that does something to you on a deeper level. That's, very subjective answer. But,
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Harri. We have a question up there.
Thank you so much, Harri, for the illuminating sharing. I have two questions. They might just be one question. So the first one is, you were talking about in the ancient time, you were just talking about it, there was less division between an action and thinking. So what are your thoughts in the modern society when everything is so separated into different disciplines? How can we combine thinking and doing? The second question is thinking about the image of the 7 layers of castle. I just can't help thinking like, when I go to the first castle, the door of the second castle is still unclosed. So that leads me to the thing that I'm trying really hard to unlearn, and that is the linear, even hierarchical model of progress. So how can we, what are your insight on how can we conquer that? Because mind gets it from theories all over the world, but I feel my soul and my body still have steps away from that understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a good way of putting it. I really like that. And I feel your exact frustration about this sense of, okay, I'm going to walk into the first realm, but the door's still closed. And Teresa doesn't tell you, it's not that literal when she tells you how to walk the soul. It's like, oh, there are these mansions and these kind of things happen here. But it's not like you do this bit, then you step to this bit and the door will magically open and you'll go through. It's really frustrating, but I think that's kind of the point, and that's kind of what you're getting to, the sense that it is progress in the sense that it's moving towards something that is better, that is the ultimate goal of life if you're this person. But it's not linear. It's a bit of a mess, really. I've tried many times to map out the structure of her castle, and it's all over the place, and it's great, and that's what makes it such an appealing image for your sense of self, I think. But it is, as you say, it is a process of unknowing or not knowing, of unlearning. It's one of the things that I had to cut from my talk today because I didn't have time to talk about it, is another massive overlap between mysticisms and creative practice, particularly sort of arts practices, is a focus on not knowing or unknowing as not just something that's really interesting to talk about from a sort of philosophical perspective, but something that we should actively be teaching to students and followers, that is a key method of self-improvement, for want of a better word, for knowing. And it is, I think, that sort of unknowing the linear structure that we expect and being ready to... I don't know that I can answer your question and say how to do it, because I really can't do it. The only ways I can find to do it are sort of drawing and writing and trying to think about if you're working with some ideas or thinking about the structure of your soul, following the connections that don't seem to make sense. So following the sort of weird hunches and inklings and the sort of word associations where you think, oh, that makes me think of this, but it's got absolutely there's no rhyme or reason why that connection has happened. But there is, because it's happened. And so it's a sort of unlearning of the expectation that something will follow that progression in a straight line towards something. It's far more messy. And yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't got any more help than that, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time, so I'm going to ask Harri just to take a seat, and so I can sum up our thanks for Harri after giving such a brilliant talk and asking such a range of questions. Thank you for leading us through this castle of Teresa and of learning, and I think showing us how art, or maybe I should say craft, can be such a powerful way of studying religion, history, philosophy, you name the humanities, or indeed any discipline, and revealing that creativity itself is a shared language, the way you're looking at language, that connects different forms of human expression. So thank you very much, Harri. Thanks. Good night, everyone.